Fellow citizens, today we stand at a crossroads, a moment that will define our nation's future and our commitment to the values we hold dear.
Dawn over Ouagadougou. From above, the city still sleeps, narrow streets glimmer under the first blush of light, market stalls wrapped in tarps, motorcycles lined like dominoes in the alleys. But, in the heart of the capital, under that calm surface, the air is tight with something unsaid. A storm is gathering not of wind or rain, but of intent. And at the center stands a soldier turned president who has decided that enough is enough. Ibrahim Traoré remembers the words, the smirks, from Western commentators calling him another African strongman, playing dress-up with power. The Israeli analysts who wrote him off as a young officer without the reach to matter, even some of his own advisors, leaning close in hushed tones, warning that he was moving too fast, too hard, too dangerously. But they were all looking in the wrong direction. While they measured his age and doubted his means, they missed the one thing that mattered: he was already moving. For 15 years, a web had been spun across Africa, invisible to most, but vast and deliberate. Under Benjamin Netanyahu's quiet watch, Israeli-linked companies had taken root from Lagos to Nairobi, masked as technology firms, development contractors, even security consultants. Behind those titles, data harvesting operations, surveillance systems sold to governments, and discreet intelligence outposts. It was legal enough on paper, buried in the fine print of contracts no one read, but in practice, it was something else entirely, a network of influence wrapped around the continent like steel wire, and no one had dared to touch it. That is, until the day the evidence landed on Traoré's desk. A stack of documents, satellite maps, bank transfers traced from offshore accounts, all pointing to one conclusion. This was not just business, it was control. It was the quiet hand on Africa's throat. The decision came like the crack of a rifle at dawn. There would be no long speeches, no warnings, no drawn-out diplomacy. At precisely 5 a.m., the first orders for Operation Clearsight would move. Phones would ring in embassies, armored trucks would roll through empty streets, and signs bearing foreign names would be stripped from office walls. But here's the question. What happens when one leader decides to pull the plug on an empire that no one was supposed to see in the first place? The order went out before the sun had even breached the horizon. In the dim light of a military briefing room in Ouagadougou, the clock's second hand swept toward 5 a.m., and the words were spoken with precision. 17 targets, simultaneous action, H-hour 0700. There was no mistaking the gravity. This was not a drill, not a symbolic gesture, but a coordinated legal and operational strike on a network hidden in plain sight for over a decade. Outside, engines rumbled to life. Convoys split into multiple directions, each unit holding sealed dossiers marked Operation Clearsight. Every file contained a warrant, signed under Burkina Faso's national security statutes, cross-referenced with articles from the African Union Convention on cybersecurity and personal data protection. These weren't random raids. Each was backed by a documented chain of evidence, admissible in court, and designed to withstand international scrutiny. Target 1 was the largest. From the street, it appeared to be a sleek telecommunications office, its glass facade reflecting the first streaks of morning light. Inside, however, investigators knew they would find more than routers and server racks. Hidden behind reinforced doors was a regional surveillance hub covering half the continent, with data streams from over 2 million African citizens, geolocation records, intercepted communications, financial patterns, all linked by a secure fiber channel running directly to Tel Aviv. This was no rumor. The link had been confirmed by independent cybersecurity audits and forensic packet tracing. Elsewhere in the city, plainclothes agents approached an NGO headquarters whose mission statement spoke of community health outreach. In reality, its top floor housed encrypted data vaults and biometric scanners, capturing medical and identification records under the guise of aid distribution. Another team moved on a technology incubator in Bobo-Dioulasso, where so-called innovation labs had been quietly compiling agricultural yield maps, water resource data, and mining surveys, information that could tilt entire sectors if leaked or sold abroad. By 6:45 a.m., all units were in position. Radios crackled with final confirmations. No collateral disruption, evidence secured, all foreign nationals to be processed according to international consular agreements. The objective was clear: dismantle the physical infrastructure of unauthorized intelligence collection while preserving a flawless legal posture. This was as much about protecting sovereignty as it was about proving, in the court of public opinion, that Africa's defense of its digital borders could be as decisive as any military campaign. At precisely 7 a.m., the city shifted, doors swung open, uniformed officers entered with calm authority. Hard drives were sealed in tamper-proof cases, servers powered down under chain-of-custody protocols, and company signage was removed. There were no shouting matches, no chaos, just the quiet, deliberate execution of a decision made long before the world was awake. Yet, as the last evidence crate was loaded into an armored truck, one question lingered in the air. When a nation reclaims the right to guard its own information, does it also reclaim the power to write its own future? By noon, the streets of Ouagadougou had already heard the whispers. But it was not until the national broadcaster cut into regular programming that the country, and soon, the continent, understood the scale of what had happened. The camera found Ibrahim Traoré standing behind a simple wooden podium, the flag of Burkina Faso to his right, the African Union banner to his left. His tone was measured, but every word landed like the strike of a gavel. "Africa," he said, "is no longer your laboratory." The statement was more than rhetoric. It was a legal declaration rooted in sovereignty clauses, enshrined in Burkina Faso's constitution and supported by the African Union's 2014 Malabo Convention on Cybersecurity and Data Protection. Traoré named no country directly in his opening lines, but within minutes he addressed Benjamin Netanyahu by title, stating plainly that foreign intelligence disguised as commerce was no longer acceptable on African soil. He called it a violation not only of national security, but of the ethical obligation every state owes its citizens, to protect them from exploitation under the pretense of development. The reaction was immediate and regional. Within hours, Mali announced the suspension of all pending imports of Israeli military technology, pending a security review. Guinea followed suit, freezing contracts with 2 foreign-owned cybersecurity firms, flagged for potential intelligence risks. In Dakar, Senegalese lawmakers called for a parliamentary inquiry into critical infrastructure projects funded by foreign tech entities. The pattern was unmistakable. One country's decision had shifted the center of gravity. At the African Union headquarters in Addis Ababa, an emergency closed-door session convened. Delegates debated strategies to counter covert intelligence infiltration, from revising procurement laws to creating a continental digital forensics task force. For years, such topics had been discussed in hushed tones, often shelved to avoid diplomatic friction. Now, they were on the main agenda, and the sense of urgency was undeniable. Back in Ouagadougou, the president's words continued to echo. "We are not a testing ground. We are not an open vault. We are the rightful stewards of our data, our resources, and our destiny." His delivery was firm, almost judicial, but the undercurrent was deeply personal. A leader drawing a line not just in law, but in the collective memory of a continent. And as the cameras faded to black, one question remained. Had Africa just taken its first irreversible step toward dismantling a system that was never meant to be seen? What began as a domestic security operation quickly turned into something far more complex. Within days of the seizures in Ouagadougou, forensic teams cross-referenced confiscated hard drives with international data traffic logs. The pattern that emerged was not isolated, it was sprawling. IP traces and encrypted transfer protocols linked to servers in Paris, London, and Washington suggested an intelligence-sharing arrangement that went beyond bilateral deals. The files revealed synchronized data pools, identical packet fingerprints moving from African soil through relay nodes in Tel Aviv, and then mirrored to Western intelligence repositories. The language in the recovered documents was clinical, even bureaucratic: joint security framework, regional stability monitoring, cross-platform analytics. But when passed alongside the captured metadata, the meaning was clear. Vast swaths of Africa's digital life were being mapped, indexed, and shared without public consent. It was the scaffolding of a surveillance architecture, built under the legal cover of trade partnerships and technology aid programs. President Traoré's assessment was blunt. In a closed parliamentary session, he called it Technological colonialism, the replacement of cannons and conquest with satellites and algorithms. Instead of occupying land with troops, this model occupied bandwidth, phone lines, and server farms. The old forts had become server rooms. The flag was now a digital watermark embedded in the flow of information. Then came the call. In a secure line conversation, confirmed by the presidential press office, Netanyahu proposed a clarification of cooperative frameworks and suggested the possibility of a joint investigation. Traore's reply, according to aides present, was as short as it was firm. Burkina Faso does not negotiate over disguised occupations. The cooperation on offer, he argued, was merely a polite name for strategic trespassing. This was not a personal quarrel, it was a structural confrontation. The discovery forced African policymakers to reframe how they viewed infrastructure. Fiber optic cables, cellular towers, and cloud storage were not just utilities, they were potential points of control. In the same way colonial powers once redrew maps to claim rivers and mines, the modern powers were redrawing invisible lines in the air and underground. And so the question sharpened: if the tools of domination have gone wireless and invisible, how does a continent defend itself without walls, and who will decide where those new borders are drawn? The counterattack didn't come from the military, it came from the airwaves. Within hours of Traore's announcement, Israeli and European media outlets were running coordinated segments, accusing him of destabilizing regional partnerships and undermining democratic engagement. Editorials painted the shutdown of foreign-linked firms as an assault on openness, hinting that Burkina Faso was sliding toward isolationism. The language was familiar, lifted from decades of press playbooks. Frame the move as anti-cooperation, avoid discussing the surveillance evidence, and cast suspicion on the leader's motives. But something had changed. Across Africa, the younger generation wasn't waiting for these narratives to be translated or interpreted. They were streaming the original press conference, comparing it to the accusations, and dissecting the mismatch in real time. Hashtags like number our data our choice and number Africa is not for sale surged on X and TikTok, not from official party accounts, but from students in Lagos, coders in Nairobi, and activists in Bamako. In Ouagadougou's Place de la Révolution, thousands gathered, waving homemade placards that fused digital age slogans with the colors of their national flags. For many of them, the issue wasn't abstract. They had seen cooperation programs arrive in their cities, promising job creation and tech training, only to discover the most advanced equipment was locked behind restricted rooms, accessible only to foreign staff. They knew the difference between a genuine exchange of skills and a one-way siphoning of information. The movement spread offline. University unions in Accra issued statements backing Burkina Faso's actions, while journalists in Kinshasa published exposés on suspicious infrastructure deals in their own capitals. Even mid-level officials from other African governments speaking off record began sharing intelligence about similar surveillance hubs, operating under non-profit or development covers. What had started as a single-country operation was turning into a continental audit. In this media battle, Traore didn't flood the channels with counterspin. Instead, he released the legal documents and technical audits that justified the raids, letting them circulate unedited. It was a calculated risk betting that an informed public could see through the layers of narrative framing. And as the chants in the streets grew louder, one question pulsed through the noise. If a generation can no longer be controlled by the stories told about them, how long before they start writing the story of the continent themselves? It was less than 3 weeks after the raids, when the next step came, not in the form of armored trucks or sealed warrants, but at a round table in Bamako. There, under the vaulted ceiling of the West African Regional Assembly Hall, Ibrahim Traoré sat flanked by ministers from Mali, Guinea, Niger, Togo, Senegal, and Ghana. The cameras captured no grand speeches at first, only the signing of a single document whose title would soon reverberate far beyond the Sahel: the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework. Its core principles were direct, almost surgical in their clarity. First, all telecommunications and data infrastructure investments on African soil must be fully transparent, with ownership structures and data handling protocols disclosed to national regulators. Second, every foreign technology company operating in member states would be subject to annual independent security audits. No exceptions, no exemptions. Third, all covert intelligence activity disguised as commercial or humanitarian work would be banned outright, with violations treated as national security offenses under regional law. And fourth, African data stays in Africa, unless there is a public, legally binding agreement specifying its use, duration, and compensation. For Traore, this was more than a policy statement. It was a legal redefinition of sovereignty. In the 20th century, nations fought to reclaim their land and resources. In the 21st, he argued, they must reclaim their data not as a byproduct of development, but as a strategic asset, as critical as gold or oil. Under the framework, data collected from African citizens could be leveraged to build AI systems tailored to African realities, guide infrastructure planning, and strengthen domestic research, all before a single byte left the continent. The symbolism wasn't lost on the crowd outside. Students from the University of Bamako unfurled banners reading, "Our land, our code, our future." Analysts noted that, unlike many regional accords, this one contained enforcement clauses, with real teeth, from cross-border sanctions to the suspension of operating licenses. But the deeper implication was geopolitical. By locking its digital frontiers, Africa was signaling that the age of open, unregulated extraction, whether of minerals, crops, or metadata, was ending. And so, as the ink dried on the framework, one question hung over the gathering. Could this pact hold firm when the world's most powerful players come knocking on the continent's digital gates? It didn't take long for the ripple to cross oceans. Within weeks of the Continental Digital Sovereignty Framework's launch in Bamako, a new set of players was stepping forward, and they were willing to play by the rules. Beijing, Moscow, and New Delhi each sent formal delegations to Ouagadougou, offering digital infrastructure partnerships built on full disclosure clauses. Even a handful of European firms, sensing the shift in market sentiment, announced their readiness to undergo third-party security audits before bidding on African telecom contracts. The message was clear. The era of silent data extraction was no longer the default. Behind the scenes, some Western capitals began quiet internal reviews of their intelligence footprints in Africa. Officials familiar with the matter in Brussels and Washington, speaking on background, admitted that the political cost of exposure was rising. In the past, such programs could operate under the radar for years. Now, one investigative leak could trigger parliamentary hearings, diplomatic expulsions, or even trade repercussions. The effect spread southward. Morocco's parliament fast-tracked a bill requiring all data centers to host primary servers within national borders. Kenya, a hub for East Africa's tech sector, rolled out new licensing requirements for foreign cloud providers, mandating that any cross-border data transfer receive explicit regulatory approval. Nigeria established a joint task force between its National Security Advisor's Office and the Communications Commission to vet foreign tech investments for potential intelligence risks. Even South Africa, often cautious about abrupt regulatory moves, updated its Protection of Personal Information Act guidelines to include infrastructure security audits. Markets took note. Companies with clean compliance records and transparent ownership began winning contracts over flashier but opaque competitors. In Accra and Dar es Salaam, tender boards openly cited alignment with continental sovereignty principles as a decisive factor in awarding deals. The shift wasn't just legal, it was cultural. Transparency was becoming a competitive advantage, while covert surveillance models, once tolerated as a cost of doing business, were now liabilities. What began as a morning raid in Ouagadougou had evolved into a continental and increasingly hemispheric conversation about the ethics of digital power. But as the map of alliances and rivalries reshaped itself, one question remained. Could this new architecture of trust survive the pressure when the next great deal is dangled before the continent? 6 months later, Ouagadougou looked and felt different. The skyline wasn't taller, but the invisible architecture, the networks and systems carrying the lifeblood of the digital economy, had changed. Internet speeds were faster, broadband costs had dropped by nearly 18%, and every major provider now published quarterly transparency reports detailing who had access to data, where it was stored, and how it was protected. The National Digital Rights Authority, once a small office inside the Ministry of Telecommunications, had grown into a cross-sector watchdog with legal authority to fine or suspend any operator violating citizen privacy. The numbers told one story, but the streets told another. In marketplaces from Bobo Dioulasso to Fada Ngoma, young entrepreneurs spoke with a new vocabulary, not just about apps or platforms, but about ownership, compliance, and data sovereignty. Farmers accessing satellite-driven weather models knew the servers processing that data were in Ouagadougou, not an undisclosed foreign city. University students joining coding bootcamps could read the open-source contracts that governed the tools they used. For Africa, the lesson was tangible. Technological independence wasn't just possible, it was profitable. Local firms won bids once reserved for foreign giants, keeping revenue in-country. The fear that rejecting opaque foreign investment would mean economic isolation had proved unfounded. Instead, new partnerships emerged, with actors willing to meet Africa on terms of mutual respect. For the world, the message was equally clear. The era when Africa's consent was assumed when agreements were signed without public scrutiny, when infrastructure doubled as an entry point for unchecked influence was over. Deals would now be judged not only by the value of what they delivered, but by the clarity of the rules they followed. When Ibrahim Traoré stood before the African Union Summit in Addis Ababa to close the year, he didn't recite statistics. He spoke plainly. We choose sovereignty. We choose transparency. We choose an Africa that controls its own digital destiny. There was no applause at first, just the quiet weight of understanding, then the deliberate rising of hands in agreement. The final scene wasn't in a government hall, but in a co-working space in Dakar. A group of young African developers leaned over laptops, debating encryption protocols and export strategies. On the wall above them, a banner from the recent Continental Digital Sovereignty Workshop read, "Our land, our code, our future." One of them looked up, eyes fixed on the map of the world pinned nearby, not with fear, but with the calm confidence of someone who knows the ground beneath their feet is theirs. And so the story closes where it began, with a choice. The question now is not whether Africa will defend its digital future, but who else will be ready to learn this lesson when their turn comes. If this story resonated with you, save the video, share it, and join the conversation in the comments, because the debate over who controls our digital lives has only just begun.